Hello everyone and welcome. In this lecture we'll be starting to work on the unit selection, so there'll be quite a bit more to come, but in this one we'll be able to make our units, and just because it's spawned on top of the here, it's already selected by default, but I can now spawn another unit, and I can click between the three of them, and it selects each one. And right now we still have them all moving regardless of who is selected, so that's the thing to move on to next. But as you can see, we've got this selection system working that handles selecting and deselecting. Let's get started. So with unit selection, we'll probably want a way as a client to have some visual feedback to see that we have selected a unit. So let's start there. Let's head over to our prefabs where we have our unit. And for now, what I want to do to show that a unit is selected is enable a little green circle underneath the player. And there's many different ways you can do this, but a really simple way that'll work for us is to create a, let's create a sprites folder, sprites. And we can make a new sprite circle. And with this, we can just leave it there as a circle. I don't know why it isn't already in projects by default, but anyway, we've got a circle. And now on the tank, we can add a new 2D object sprite, and we can drag in the circle. And personally, I want to make this green, so I'm gonna make some kind of green color like this. And the sprite is here, you just have to get really close to the tank, and you see it's down here. So let's flip it 90 degrees on the X, so 90. And we also want to scale it up. Now, if you want to scale it up to be the same radius as the navmesh agent, we can go look at the navmesh agent. The radius is 1.75. So if we do 1.75 times by 2, so then we just put 3.5, you'll see now back on the unit, it actually matches the navmesh agent perfectly. But of course, you can go bigger than this. It's up to you. But there we go. We've now got some kind of highlight, and we can toggle this on and off when we select and deselect the unit. But of course, we don't want it on by default, so let's disable this and make sure the prefab is saved like this. We can now back out of here, and we also want to do one other thing. We need some code to actually toggle that on and off. So let's go to our scripts, and we want to make a script in the units folder called unit. And let's open that up in Visual Studio Code. Now we're inside here, we can get rid of the boilerplate code, and we can also make sure that this is a network behavior, import mirror, and we're good to go. So we could just reference the sprite renderer directly. The problem with that is it then means we have to come back in the code if we ever want to modify what happens when we select the unit. So I feel like this is a good time for Unity events. A Unity event is just like on the UI. When you have a button, you can press plus or minus and say, when this button is pressed, do all these functions. So we're going to do that, but for selecting the unit. So we'll say, when you select the unit, do this. When you deselect the unit, do this. And the way we do that is by having a serialized field private reference to a Unity event. So let's do this right, Unity event. And we'll call it onSelected. And then what we can do is we can come back here and hit Control period and import Unity engine.events. And I'm going to copy paste this line for onDeselected. And without coding anymore, just to show you what this is now, if we go back into Unity, we can head over to our prefab and add on the script. So prefabs, unit, let's add on the unit script. And you now see we get this just like on a UI button. And we can say, well, on selected, we want to take this sprite, I'll rename it in a second, and we want to say sprite renderer enabled true, tick the box. So now whenever we select this unit, we want to enable the sprite renderer, and then quite simply on deselect, grab the sprite renderer, enabled false like this. Hey everyone, Future Nathan here, and apparently in newer versions of Mirror, there's actually an issue where the sprite renderer component will automatically be turned on when it's not meant to be. So a way to get around this is actually to change the two events to instead activate and deactivate the game object rather than the sprite renderer component. So you can just drag in the game object with the sprite renderer on, and then go to the game object dropdown on the event, and then set active true or set active false. So if you're having that issue, then just try that and everything should work just fine. And we'll rename this to be like selected highlight. Back over in the code, we now want to add some way to select and deselect the unit. So we'll make two methods for that, and these can be client-side methods because the server doesn't actually need to know which units are selected, because as soon as we want to move or attack, we just tell the server these are the units we want to move and attack with. So we don't actually need them to store at all times which we have selected. So we can just do this client side, so make a public void select and a public void deselect. And these are client-only methods, so I think it makes sense just to tag them with client. It makes it a lot easier to understand what's going on. And we can, of course, put this in a client region. Whoops. We will be adding server code in here in a future lecture, but not right now. So we have this region, and all we want to do in here is raise the event. So to raise the selected event, you type unselected, and then you do question mark dot invoke. Now the reason there's a question mark means that if this is null, if there are no, if you said to do nothing, then just don't invoke it. So by invoking it, it means, you know, do the things we've set up in the inspector. And this doesn't invoke if it's null. But in our case, it's not null, it's just a safety check. So we can do that for deselecting to on deselect.invoke. But right now, this doesn't protect ourselves from, you know, trying to select the enemy units. So let's make sure if we try and select a unit, if we don't have authority, then just return. And we can do that for deselecting as well. We want to just say, you know, ignore it if it's not our unit. And that's it for the unit. Now we want to have some script to actually, you know, select the unit. We want to have that script also handle multi-select, so we can drag a box around our units, but that won't be in this lecture, it'd be far too long. We'll be doing that in the next one. For now, we'll just have it so we can select a single unit at a time, and then, as I said, we'll move on to doing multi-select. So let's make a script for our units, and we'll make a new C# script called the unit selection handler. And we'll open that one up. We will be building on top of this script over the coming lectures. For now, we want to just get it as simple as it needs to be for selecting a single unit. So we want reference to the main camera so that we can do raycasting. So private camera main camera. And then in the start method, what do we want to do? Well, we want to say get the main camera, so camera.main. And then we also want to say we need somewhere to store our units that we've selected. And for now, even though it's just one, we'll still use a list because then we won't have to come back and change it later. So to do that, we can say here, let's have a private list of type, what should the type be? A unit, of course, and then selected units. And initialize that as a new list. So we will store in here all the units that are currently selected. Now, as I mentioned, we will be having drag select, which means we need to do different things on mouse down, and then on mouse stay down, because we can drag and make a box, and mouse release is when we actually do the selecting. So we want to kind of, you know, make sure we take that into consideration now so we don't have to completely refactor it. So what we'll do is in the update method, so let's say private void update, we want to check the input. So we'll say if mouse, so we want to get in the Unity engine.input system namespace. If mouse.current.left button was pressed this frame. So if we pressed the left mouse button this frame, we want to start the kind of selection area, but obviously in our case, we don't really have the selection area. So let's leave a comment here. So in the lecture where we do this, we know exactly where we want it. So this is where we start the selection area. And then we can say else if mouse.current.left button. If this was the frame when we released it, so it was release this frame, this is where we want to kind of end the selection area, or let's say clear selection area. So if we've just clicked a single unit, we've released our button, or if we've dragged, we've clicked dragged release, so we want to get all the units. So this is the function where we get all our units. Let's hit control period and generate this method. So clear selection area, what we want to do, in our case right now, is just check for a single unit. We're not doing any box selecting. To do that, we want a ray, just like how we've done raycast before. So it's the main camera.screen point to ray, and we need to pass in the position, which is our mouse position. So let's say mouse.current.position.readValue. So we've said this is where our mouse is. Now do the raycast. So we want to say if the raycast hits nothing, then return. So if not physics.raycast, it wants a ray, so we pass in our ray. The data from that raycast, we've done this like 3 times in the course so far. So let's say raycast hit. That's the hit data. How far do we want it to go? Well, it's basically just as far as it can go until it hits something. So let's say mathf.infinity. And then finally, the layer mask. So the layer mask is what we can and cannot hit. And we'll be thinking more about layers in its own lecture. For now, we still need to have it. So let's just make it at the top. We want to say serialize field private layer mask equals a new layer mask. If you've never used layer masks before, we can head into Unity in a minute. We'll have to compile first, so let's just pass in the layer mask. So if we don't hit that raycast, then return. Yeah, to show you what layer mask is, in case you don't know, we need to first of all add this game object onto something. So let's say create an empty game object, and we'll call this the unit selection handler. And we'll add on the unit selection handler. You see here we get this layer mask. So every object in Unity will have a layer. So if I click the spawn point, pretty much everything here should be default. So what this means is we're going to raycast only against things that have the layers we select. And currently it means we're not going to hit anything with our raycast. So we can say default for now, which means anything with the default tag is what we will hit. And we've also got to remember this selection and deselection right now will be going on even when we're not in a game, because we just have this one scene. But when we make a lobby and an actual game scene separately, then we'll be dropping this into the game scene. It shouldn't be in the lobby, but it's good enough for now. Let's reset this, go back to the code. So at this point, it means we've hit something with the ray. But just because we've hit something doesn't mean it's necessarily right. So we want to say, from the thing we hit, let's make sure it's a unit or not. So we'll say if not, and then here's the hit data. So we can check what we hit. We can check the collider, and we can get a component. Now remember, we stuck a unit component onto the unit. So we can say, let's try to get the unit component. That's how you say that. And if you do get it, then it'll pass it out here. So we can say out unit. But I'm going to return because I've said here, if not. So if the thing we hit is not a unit, if the thing we hit does not have a unit component, then return. But if it does have a unit component, then we can use it here. And what we can do is we can check, do we have authority over that unit? So if not unit dot has authority, we can return as well. So at this point, if we go to this line, we know now we hit something with our click. The thing we hit is a unit, and the unit it belongs to us basically. And now finally we can actually select it. So we can say selected units.add, let's add it to the list. So add the unit. And we want to now say go and select all the units in this list. And right now it might seem kind of pointless because we just have one, but keep in mind we'll be adding multi-select, and we'll be adding a way for you to hold shift and like drag select one box, drag select two box, and they get added together as opposed to drag clear. So let's say for each unit selected unit in selected units, so loop over that list, and we'll say selected unit dot select. And remember, select is the function we made earlier where we check down here to say, well, if we own it, then raise the event, which will then in turn turn on and off the little highlight. So this is the method for actually selecting a unit. So the last thing to do is to go over to our unit prefab, and we want to give it a collider that we can actually hit when we click it. And we'll also use it later for, of course, hitting with projectiles and dealing damage. So let's add a collider. And what do we want to use? I mean, it's really what you think fits the object best. The object here for the navmesh agent uses this cylinder. We don't really have a cylinder collider. We do have a capsule collider, but that also might feel a bit odd. I think we should go with a box collider. So let's add that. And we want to position it a bit better because right now it's not really in the best place. So let's move up the center to be around about the tank center. We don't have to get this perfect. And I'm going to turn on this mode here where we can edit the collider simply by dragging these things forwards and backwards. So that's about the front of the tank, and this is about the back of the tank. And then if we go to this side, that's about that side, and that's about there. As I said, we can make this a bit better later. And as for the height, we can drag this up, and the base, we can drag this down. So we've got a rough collider here for the tank, and we can also, edit it as a trigger. So this box won't physically collide with objects, but it will detect raycasts, and later on it will detect projectiles as well. Let's now hit play and see what happens. So we should be able to select our units, but there might be a problem because we spawn our units right now directly on top of the spawner. So what it will actually do when we spawn in a unit is it will immediately select it because my mouse is over the collider. So it spawns in the unit and then does the raycast at the same time. So now we select our unit and all our units are going to be selected. And we know this isn't just because they're enabled in the prefab by accident, because if we were to go to the unit prefab, you'll see the highlight is not enabled, but it is, if I go to one of these units, it's enabled over here. So all we need now is some code to actually handle deselection. So your challenge is to deselect the units. We want you to deselect all of the already selected units. We want to always clear our units whenever we start clicking again. And remember to, after you've deselected them, clear the list. So right now, the flow is add to the list and then loop and select. Now you want to do it the reverse. You want to loop and deselect, then clear the list. So have a go, pause the video, and I'll be back in a second. Okay, I hope you gave that a go. Let's see how to do it. So all you really want to do is head back into the code, and we go up to here wherever we're meant to start the selection area. And we'll just do it in here for now. So whenever we press the left mouse button, like I put on the slide, we want to say for each unit, selected unit. So let's just copy this loop from down here, it'll be faster. But instead of selecting, we want to deselect them. And simply after we've done the loop, we want to clear the list. So selected units dot clear. And that's it. So if we go back into Unity now, we should have the selecting and deselecting working. And obviously right now, the movement doesn't even care about the selected units. So if I was to just test this and maximize, if I make a unit, when I click on and off, it actually selects and deselects. If I make another unit, it selects that one, and now it selects that one. And now I can click between the three of them to select them. Obviously this one gets in the way of the other one, so it's harder to hit it. But you see the point is we can click on the tanks and select them. We need to now make it in the next video or in one of the upcoming videos that when we do a command like moving, it only does it to our selected unit, because right now it still does it to all three. But you see we now store the list of selected units, which in our case is just one, and we highlight it and deselect it when we're done. So yeah, that's it for this lecture. We've now got it so that I can click on the separate tanks and select them and deselect them. I can then just click over here to lose my selection. We still want to add the feature to have multi-select and have it, obviously, more importantly, that we can only move the ones that we've got selected. But yeah, that's it for now, and I'll see you in the next lecture. Goodbye. Hello everyone, and welcome. In this lecture, we've taken what we already had with selection to now have it so that we can only move if we are selected. So if I deselect and try moving, nothing happens. If I spawn in two, nothing happens. If I select just this one, only this one moves, and same over here. And if I go to the server, obviously this client, this host here, still does the exact same thing where only the selected unit listens to the commands, and it's pretty cool. Let's get started. Now we're wanting a way so that our movement only happens for the units that are selected. So right now, the movement code itself takes in input, but we shouldn't be doing that. We should have some other script to take in input, and then based on whether we click on the floor or click on another unit, we should move or attack and do all those kind of things. So let's make a script to handle that. We should make a script called the unit command giver, or something to that meaning. So unit command giver. And with this, we'll open it up in Visual Studio Code. And inside here, we're going to need to know which units to even give the commands to. And luckily for us, we wrote in the previous lecture this unit selection handler, and it has a list of units, but it's private right now, and we want to be able to actually read this. So let's make it public, and let's rename it to a capital S, so it's selected units. And we should also make this a getter so that we can't accidentally set the list elsewhere. So if we just say get like this, now what will happen is if we go back to the command giver, we can say in here, well, first of all, we need reference to the other thing. So let's add a reference to a unit selection handler called the unit selection handler, we'll say. And then let's say, for example, in the start method, so private void start, if we want to check what units there are, we can say unit selection handler dot selected units. This is a list of unit. but we can't say equals, we can't set it by accident because we've made it a getter only. So it's protected us from doing that. That's why I added the getter. Now we actually want to do raycasting in here in the selection handler, but we also want to do it for the command giver. So it's kind of a bit of the same code, not completely, but some of it is the same. We want to have a private camera again. So private camera, main camera. And then we want to get that in start. So the main camera is camera.main. And then in the update method, so private void update, we want to basically raycast if we press the right mouse button, and then based on whatever we hit with the raycast, we want to tell all of the selected units to move to the location or attack the target or whatever. We can always refactor later if we need to with, taking logic out of the update loop. We'll be doing some of that now, but we won't be going too rigorously. So we'll say if, and this is checking for input on the mouse button. So if not mouse, so input system, dot current, and we're checking the right mouse button. So right button dot was pressed this frame. So if we didn't press the right mouse button this frame, we don't want to do any commands, so let's return. If we didn't press right mouse button, return. Though if we did, we want to do a raycast. So ray equals main camera dot screen point to ray. It's the same as we're used to. The mouse dot current dot position dot read value. So we've got a ray. Now we actually want to do the raycast, but just like usual, we'll do the if we don't hit the ray. So if not physics.raycast, ray out, and let's get the data for the raycast hit, call it hit, the usual mathf.infinity, and just like last time, we need a layer mask again for what we can give commands to. So let's just make a, we'll just add it here, it doesn't really matter. So let's field private, layer mask equals a new layer mask. And the reason we do this as opposed to null is because this is a class reference. Layer masks are structs, not classes. If we go here, it's a struct, so it's a bit different. We go down here, and we want to pass in the layer mask and do return. So far, if we look at this code here, it's basically the same as in the selection handler down here, where we do this raycast here. It's basically the same. And at this point, it means we've hit something. Let's try to move to it. We will be adding in logic later for attacking, but for now we only have moving. So let's just say try move and hit dot point. That's what we want to move to. So let's make a method down here called private void try move. And what it should do is it should go over each unit in our selected units and tell them to move. So for each unit in unit selection handler dot selected unit. So we're going to loop over all the units and say unit dot, and we want to tell it to move, but the move code is not in the unit, it's in the unit movement. So what we should be able to do is we should be able to get the unit movement from the unit. So let's jump over to the unit script. Over in unit, let's add a reference at the top. So a serialized field, private unit movement, and we'll call it unit movement. And we want to be able to get this, so let's make a getter up here. So we'll just say public unit movement, get unit movement, and all it's going to do is going to return unit movement. So we've made a getter, and then back over here we can say dot get unit movement dot move. We haven't made the move method public, so let's go to unit movement. The way we did it here, remember, is we have this command move on the server, and then over here we have our input on the client side, and then we call command move. So all this client side code can go. We don't need any of this client code in here. We just want the server code for now, and we can get rid of the main camera. So we just have this, and let's also right click or control period to get rid of the usings we don't need. So we're just left with this now, and let's make sure the command move is now public, and that allows us to go back to the command giver and call cmd move. And where do we want to move to? We want to move to this hit dot point. So we need to pass in this vector free. So we'll say vector free point, and there we go. So the logic now is when we right click, do a raycast, if we don't hit anything, return, but if we do, try and move all of our selected units to that spot. So we now only move selected units. The movement script is told where to move. It doesn't actually take input anymore. This will still require us now to go back to Unity and to set some things up on our prefab. So if we go head over to our prefab, let's go to prefabs, unit. We've got the unit script and the unit movement script, so we need to reference that in there. And now we need to go back into the scene, and let's put them both on this object. So this can also have the unit command giver, and it needs reference to the selection handle. Let's drag that in. And for the layer mask, we'll just use the same default layer for now. And we'll call this object like the unit handlers. Now let's give this a build and see if it works. Build and run. So I've got the build here. Let's go over into the editor and spawn in a unit and move it. So this is selected and it's moving. If I spawn in a new unit, this one's selected, not this one. And look how the movement now only affects this unit. And if I click back over here, now the movement only affects this unit. And if I tab out over here, I don't actually see this person's selection ring, which is good. It doesn't really make sense to. And then I can spawn in my own units and select those and move those around like so. Pretty cool. If I start right clicking and nothing is selected, then nothing's going to happen. I actually need to select a unit to start moving it. Cool. So yeah, that's it for this lecture. We've gone from having all our units moving every single time we click to now only moving if they are selected. We can still make this whole thing much better by adding multi-select. It'll be quite fun now to be able to go click here, drag down here, and we make a box, and then it selects the 3 units and we move them, or just selecting 2 and moving that. So that's what we'll be doing over in the next few lectures. So I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye. Hello everyone and welcome. By the end of this lecture, we'll have it set up so that each player object will actually store the list of units for that player. So if player 1 comes and spawns in 3 different units like this, and we click back on player 1, we'll see over here they have the 3 different units. And then if we click on the other player, we see they have none. But if I now go and spawn one in, we'll see it's been added to this list. And if I obviously keep spawning more in, you'll see them being added to this list. This will then allow us to move on to do multi-select, so we can drag over loads of units, and then it can figure out based on which units are in my units list, this list here, we can then select all of those. Let's get started. So the goal of this lecture is to end up with all the clients storing a list of their own units, and then having the server store a list of all the clients' units. So me as player 1, I don't need to know player 2's units necessarily, but the server does need to know everyone's units. So I'll start off with the method of having the server store all the units. So the first thing to do is head over to our unit script. So script, units, unit. So previously we used events to say when we select and deselect a unit, then what to do when that happens. So it's a way of triggering other logic when something happens or something is invoked. In our case, we want to use, so these are Unity events, we want to use normal C# events so that in another script we can have some code that gets triggered when a unit is spawned. So we're going to need 2 events for the server to know when a unit spawns and when a unit despawns or dies. And the way we do this is we need to make it public so we can subscribe in another script. We want to make it static, meaning we don't actually need reference to any particular unit to know when a unit spawned, and that's a good way to do it. It's going to be an event, so we use the event keyword, and then we have to put what type of event we're using. So there are plenty of different types of events in C#. You can use delegates, you can use event handlers, there's different ways. We're going to use actions. Actions are really simple. You just type action. We need to then do control period and import system. So then after action, you put in the type. Now this is any data you want to pass through with the event. So when a unit spawns, it's pretty useful to tell whoever's listening what unit actually spawned. So let's say unit. And then after this, we just give it a name. So let's say server, because it's going to be called on the server, on unit spawned. So with this now, we can invoke it in the script somewhere, and then we can say on the server when a unit spawns. Then in a different script, we can say, oh, what was that? A unit spawned. Let's add it to a list of units. And we want to do the same for despawning. So let's copy paste this and change it to be despawn. And now we just need to call them in here. So I think what makes sense, a unit is spawned when it starts existing and is despawned when it stops. So let's use start and stop server methods. So just like how we've got, start and stop client, we've also got it for servers. Let's make a server region. So region server and region. And then in here, we can override on start server and override on stop server. And in these cases, what we want to do is we want to raise the events. So just like the same syntax from down here where it's event ? .invoke, it's basically the same up here. So in start server, we want to say server on unit spawned, make sure you get the right one, dot invoke, and we need to pass through a unit because we said up here the type is a unit, and which unit has spawned? Well, it's this thing, so we just put this in. And of course, for onStop server, it's the same thing, just with the other event. So let's say copy paste server on unit despawned. So now we've got these two events that are raised only on the server because it's only called onStart and stop server whenever a unit is spawned and despawned. So now we just need somewhere else to listen for that event and to add it to a list. Let's head back into Unity and make a new script. We want some player script to store all the units for that player. So let's go to scripts, and inside networking, we have RTS network manager. Let's make the RTS player script. Open it up. Now this is going to be a network behavior because it's going to be a networked object, and we need to know when we're a client, when we're a server. So let's add using mirror and get rid of this. We want to store a list of all of our units. So let's make a private list of type unit. And we'll just call it my units and make that an empty list. And now we need somewhere in here to actually add to the list. And we want to subscribe to these two events over in here to know when that happens, when we spawn and despawn a unit. So let's make, let's override onStart server and override onStop server. And this is where we need to subscribe and unsubscribe from those events. So we can say over here, unit dot, and it's server on unit spawned, and we can then plus equals, and then we can add the name of another method, and it will actually call that method whenever a unit is spawned on the server. So let's make a method for that. We'll make a private void, and we'll call it server handle unit spawned. And for now, we'll just leave it empty, though it actually does need to take in a unit because we're going to pass a unit in. So let's just say unit. And over here now we can add this method to it, like this. And what will happen is, as we said, whenever we invoke this server on unit spawned, it'll then in here say, okay, let's handle that with whatever logic we want to put in this method. And we need the same thing for despawning, so let's make a second method for despawned. And we want to, over here, copy paste this. And we want to say subscribe to server despawned. And the method we want to call when something is despawned is this one, which is server handle unit despawned. And with events, when you subscribe, you should also unsubscribe whenever you need to. So if we're going to subscribe in onStart, we're going to unsubscribe in onStop. And to do that, it's as simple as the exact same lines, but with minus equals instead of plus equals, because we are unsubscribing from the events. Here we are subscribing, and here we're unsubscribing. Before we move on, just make sure that you've got the spawned event hooked into the spawn method, and same with the despawned event hooked into the despawned method. If you've got any of that the wrong way around, or that your pluses and minuses are the wrong way around, then you'll come across some problems later on. So just take a minute to make sure you've got everything the right way around. Now we've got to remember that this RTS player script, we will be putting it on the player object, and all the clients are going to have a player object. And we don't want each one's list to be the exact same, which would mean it would have the list of every unit in the game. We want each list to have the units for that player. So when we spawn a unit on the server, we need to do a check here to make sure it's the right one. So we're going to say if the unit that was spawned, and what we can do, we're on the server here, so we can say, let's make sure the connection to client dot connection ID, we can say basically, is the client that owns this unit the same as this player's, owner? Are these the same person? So we say if not, connection to client dot connection ID, then we can return. But if it is, it means yes, this is the person that owns that unit. Therefore, we can add it to my units dot add, and we can add the unit. And of course, for despawning, it's the same thing. Whenever a unit dies or is despawned for any reason, make sure that the connection ID of the unit is the same as the connection ID of this player. If it is the same person, then my units dot remove. Let's have a quick look over what we've just done in case any of you didn't quite get it. So the reason we've named these events server on is because I usually like to start off with where it's getting called. So this event is only being called on the server, and it's called when a unit is spawned, and this is called on the server when a unit is despawned. And here's where we triggered them, and we pass through this particular unit that was spawned or despawned. But by having this, we're just basically saying, hey, this happened we don't know, we don't care in here what happens. We're just saying, everyone, this happened. Then the RTS player script is something that cares when that happens. That's why when the RTS player starts existing and stops existing, it subscribes and unsubscribes from this event. So when this exists, we are now aware of when a unit is spawned and despawned. And when it happens, we want to call these two methods. So when a unit is spawned, we do this, and when a unit is spawned, we do this. Despawned, sorry, we do this. And we just make sure that the person who owns the unit is the same person that owns this player, or that is this player. And if so, then we add, and if so, then we remove. And now we're left with a list on each player object of the units that that player owns. But that is only true on the server right now. Only the server actually knows those lists. The clients don't really know. And of course, the host, who is both, technically does know because they are the server too. So we need to make it so that all the other clients also store a list of units, but only their own units. We don't need to store anyone else's units. The reason we need to do that is so that the clients will know which units they can multi-select and which units they can command to move and attack with. So it's really useful to have that list. So if we head back into the unit script, what we really want here is we want another two events, but not server on unit spawned. We want a kind of authority on unit spawned. So it's going to happen on clients, but only for the units that they have authority over. So we want to make those events, and then we want to subscribe to them in here, but in the client methods, not the server methods. And we also want to make sure that if we are the host, so if we're both, we don't do any of that. Because if we start subscribing on the server and the client here, then what will happen is we'll have duplicated elements in the list. Because we'll add on, we'll make a list for all the players, and then we'll make a list for ourselves too. So then we'll have, in our own list, two of everything, and it'll start to cause problems. So your challenge is to store your own units as a client. It's not to do the whole thing, only the first part, and then I'll be doing the rest with you. So I'd like you to create the two events that we just mentioned for when a unit is spawned and despawned. Raise the events in onStart and onStop client, because obviously it's a client-side thing. But we can't just do that, because if we do that, then it'll spawn for all clients. We want to make sure to only raise if you are a server, so you can do that by checking. If you check is client only, it's a bool. And that'll tell you, quite simply, if you're a client only. Or if you don't have authority, which you can check with the has authority bool, because if you're the server or you don't have authority, then of course you don't want to raise it. So you just want to add an if check before you raise the events. So have a go, pause the video, and I'll be back in a minute. Okay, I hope you paused the video and gave that a go. Let's head back. So like I said, the first thing to do is to make the events. So let's duplicate this and rename this to be authority and authority, and head down to wherever the client methods are, and we want to override start and stop client, like I said. So start client, override stop client, and here we want to raise the event. So authority on unit spawned dot invoke this, just like how we did up here. Copy and paste. And it's despawned here. And then to add the if checks in, so if statement, and then if we're not a client only, or not has authority, return. So basically, if we're the server or we don't have authority, then return. And we want to do the same thing down here. So let's paste that here. So now we only call if we have authority over the object and we're not the server. Let's head over to the RTS player now. So that's as much as I expected you to do on your own, and now I'm going to help you with the end of it. So this is all the server code. Let's split this up into a region so it's much easier to see what's going on. And region. I want a region for the client stuff. And in here, what do we want to do? We want to use the onStart client and onStop client. So onStart client, onStop client. So we only want to subscribe in here to the event if we're a client only. Because if we're a host, we're going to be subscribing to these and the other ones, and we'll end up having the problem with duplicated lists. So what we should do at the start of here is say, if we're not clients only, then return. It makes sure we only subscribe once if we're the host. This is just to stop the host having duplicate problems. And we want to do it in both of these. And in reality, to save us some time, we can just copy these methods and swap the word server for authority. So let's make sure these are minuses. and that it's authority on. So then I can just copy paste the word authority and go over server. Just get this all done like so. And then over here, we actually need some methods for these because we have these server methods to handle spawning and despawning, but we want some authority methods. So let's put them down here. And of course, call them authority like this. Just fix the name of this one. I accidentally pasted only part of it. And at this point, we know that we're only calling it on our own authoritative object, meaning we don't actually need to do this check at all. And we can't really do it anyway. We don't know about the connections to different clients because we're not on the server. So we can just remove this and simply add to the list. That's all we need to do whenever a unit is spawned, and then we have authority and we're not the server. But the final little thing to remember is that right now, on the client, what would actually happen is that we have authority over a particular unit that spawns, but it'll add it to all the different players, because we also need to check in here when we add it that we have authority over this particular player object. Because it's true that we have authority over the unit, but to add it to the list in here, we should check if has authority return, or sorry, if not has authority, then return. So let's say not, and same down here. And now we're done. We are now left with each player having a list. If we're just a client, we only have our own list of units. If we're the server, we have a list for everyone. And if we're the host, it's the same, we just have a list for everyone. And one way we can check this is if we go up, we can make this for now a serialize field private, so that if we go into the Unity editor, and we test this in a minute, we'll actually be able to see the list of units in the editor. So if I go to my prefabs, player, let's add on the RTS player script, and we have a list of units here, which of course is empty. But we should be able to see that it'll actually start filling up as we spawn in units. Let's build the game and give it a go. And now that it's built, we can host over here, join as a client over here. And what we'll see is, let's say this client over here spawns in 2 tanks. What we can do is we can go back over here and look in the player object and see we actually have this list of 2 tanks. And if we see, obviously one is the top one and the second is the second one, which are these 2 tanks. If I go in here and spawn in my own tank, and I go to my own player, we see it has 1 in here, and let's click on it, it's this 3rd one, which is here. So now these 2 player objects now store the list of the units that belong to that player. So yeah, that's it for this lecture. I know this wasn't as much of an interesting one, it's just adding stuff to a list, but it's really going to help when we move on to do multi-selecting, because now we can drag a box and we can loop over all of my units and see which units are inside that box, and then easily just loop over and select them. We'll be doing something similar for buildings in the future. So whenever we spawn a building, the server needs to track who has what buildings, and you as a client need to track your own buildings. And then we can do stuff like adding a building range limit, so you can only place buildings that are near to your other buildings. So for that, we'd actually need to know who has what buildings and where they all are. But as I said, that's it for now, and we can move on to multi-selecting. I'll see you there. Hello everyone, and welcome. In this lecture, we'll be working on multi-selecting so that we can take the list of our units that we have from the previous lecture, and then we can drag select over our units, make a box, release, and then we can select these 2 units, or just tap this one, or select all 3, it's up to you, and then have as many units as you want and select all of those. So there's no limit here really, it's up to you, and we can add extra features in the future for, let's say I want to select these 2 and then select these 3, I can hold down a key and select them. It's currently not a feature, but we can add that. We can expand upon this. But as it is right now, by the end of this lecture, it'll be really good to move on to start doing attacking and some more fun things now that we can send our army to go and kill the enemy base, for example. Let's get started. So the first thing to do in this lecture is actually to take what we have right here. This is pretty much the gameplay scene, but we also have the network manager here, and we join to the server and start as a client, all within the gameplay scene. It's not really ideal. We need to separate them out. And we need to do it now because we have all these unit selection handler command givers, and we're going to be making the drag select on the UI, but that shouldn't exist in this menu scene because our code will try and grab all the units for our player, and if we're doing it in the menu, we won't even have a player object, so it'll cause all sorts of problems. Let's separate them out. If we go through this scene, everything in here is actually what we want inside the gameplay scene, apart from the network manager. That's it, we just want the network manager in a separate scene. So what we can do is I can just drag the network manager down here. I want to basically copy how it's set up right now into a different scene. So let's keep that, and I'll just put it in the prefabs folder, you know, keep our network manager in here. And what we can do is we can make a new scene for the menu. So let's make a new scene called like scene_menu. And then I'll rename this to be like scene_, and then let's imagine we have different maps. So let's go map 01. And I'll also rename this lighting data. So scene_01 lighting settings. And this folder here stores the nav mesh data. So let's do that. So here's all our map 01 stuff, and here's our main menu. In the main menu, we just want to drop in our prefab for the unit, the network manager we just made. And if we look over here, we see we have this offline and online scene. Now that's actually really useful for us now. What will happen is the network manager will automatically change our scene for us to the offline scene when we, you know, stop hosting, stop the server, stop a client. And then when we connect or host or start a server, we'll switch to the online scene. So for now, what we need to do is we need to go to our scenes, and let's drop in the menu scene into the offline scene, and then map 01 to the online scene. And if we save and hit play, we should be able to give this a test. So if I was to hit host, we go to the other scene, I can spawn in a tank, I can control it, I can deselect, I can select. All the stuff I could already do, I can make more tanks, select them. And if I hit stop host, I go back to the menu, I can hit start host, and I start a new game. And now we can actually start working on the multi-select. So let's head over to the gameplay scene, and the place where we want to do this code is we want to do it inside the unit selection handler. Obviously, we've currently got single unit selecting, now we want to add multi-selecting. We also want some UI. We want a box to appear on the screen when we click, so that the bottom left corner of the box, or not necessarily the bottom left corner, because I could click up here and drag down, but the corner, the starting corner, will be wherever I click. And then wherever I drag to, we'll recalculate the size and position so that we make a box as we drag. We can do that by adding a UI element to the child here, and then we can reference it in the script and change it. So let's add a UI and image. And this image, we want to be transparent so we can actually see what's beneath our selection box. So let's make it black, but then turn down the alpha so we can kind of see through it a bit. And it's up to you to tweak this value, but I'm going to go for a value of about 75. And we really want to be able to encode, change the like anchor position and the size, so the width and the height, and that will allow us to basically make it match where we click and where we drag to. So let's just reset it to 100 for now, it doesn't really matter. And we can call this, for example, the like drag box. And then we can reference the drag box in code, and we can change the width, the height, the position, and all that stuff. Once we're done with the coding, we'll come back and we'll clean this up, and we'll turn stuff off and get it all how it should be when we press play, because right now it's on, so we'll have it off like this. Well, let's actually do that right now. So turn off the drag box, head back to the menu scene, and so when we test, we can just hit play and start a host. We won't need to build to test this because it's kind of just a one-player thing. It's only for yourself. And now we can open up the unit selection handler script. Like I mentioned, we're going to need reference to that image, of course. So serialize field, and we want to store a reference to a rect transform. That's the component we're going to be modifying, and we'll call it the unit selection area. We also need to store reference to our player object, our RTS player, and that's because we'll need to, every time we drag select, loop over our list of units from the last lecture and basically check which ones are in our box. So we can say private RTS player player. One other variable we need over here is we need to know the start position of our drag. So when we click to start dragging, we need to store where we started clicking, because obviously every frame we can check where our mouse currently is, but we also need to know where we started clicking. So let's store private a vector2, because it's just on the UI, so it's flat. We just need an X and a Y coordinate, and we'll call it like start position. So to get reference to our player, even though we're not in a network behavior, you can still do it, because you do this. You say player equals, and then if we use the network client class, so network client, we have to import mirror here, so control period, let's just do this. So network client dot, and you can get the connection. Obviously this will be null if you don't have a connection as a client, but we know if we're in the gameplay scene and we've joined the normal way, we will have a connection. So network client.connection, and then you can get the identity, which will give you the identity component, which is basically on the player, and then you can just say get component RTS player. So say get our connection, get the player object for our connection, and on the player object, get the player script, which is what we made with all this stuff from last time, where we store the list of units we have. If we go down to the update method, what we have right here now is when we press the left mouse button, we deselect all the units, and then that's basically it. And then if we release the mouse button, we clear the selection area. And by clearing the selection area, I mean we clear the square, the box that we drag on the screen. And at the moment, we don't actually have that. That's what we'll be adding right now. We're also going to want another method for the frames where we didn't press or release, the ones where we've got it held down. So we're going to say else if mouse.current.left button is pressed. So if it is pressed, then we want to make a method for, let's say, update selection area. And that will just update the box's size every frame where we have the mouse button down. So let's go down here. So we've got obviously the clear selection area. Let's make an update selection area. So private void update selection area. And to keep it clean, what we should do is we should have another method here. So private void start selection area. And for now, we can just move this code. We can cut it and paste it into the start. And then we'll call start here. Start selection area. So we've got it like this. Just if we did this, start. If we did this, clear. If we did this, then update it. So remember, starting is when we put our mouse button down. So we do want to do all of this. We want to deselect all our units, clear the list, and then we also want to enable the selection area, the bit of UI we just made. We want to turn it on. So unit selection area dot game object, we can set active true. We also want to store the start position when we start. So let's say start position equals, and it's our current mouse position. So mouse.current.position.read value. So that gets us our current mouse position. And as well as setting all this stuff up, we also want to call update selection area, because on the frame where we press it down, it doesn't normally get called up here. Remember, this only happens else if it was released this frame. So, else if it's pressed. So we need to call it manually in here. And this is just to kind of, update selection area. And in here, we can now start writing what happens every frame when the mouse is down. All we really want to do is update the UI to be the right size, the little box. So what we can do is we can grab our mouse position, because we'll be using this variable quite a few times here. So mouse position. We can say mouse.current.position.read value. And with this, we can figure out the height, the width and the height of our box, because we already have the start position and our current position, so we can quite easily figure out that size. We can say float. So let's say the area width is equal to the mouse position.x minus the start position.x. So that's going to give us how wide to go. And then the height is, you'll probably be able to guess it, area height is mouse position.y minus start position.y. I'll just quickly jump over to a diagram in case any of you don't get it so far. So we have this box here, and I've just labeled basically the corners as yellow dots and the center point as a red dot. And our mouse will have clicked in the bottom left, for example, and we'll currently have our mouse in the top right. So the width is simply the x value, so the horizontal from the bottom left to the top right. And then the height is the vertical from the bottom left to the top right. And that will give us our width and height. It's that simple. And then all we need to do with this width and height of our box is change the size of the UI. So this unit selection area, it has a value called size delta. And if you set that, which is a vector 2, well, let's figure it out. So what is the value? It's going to be the width and the height, but we can drag boxes from bottom left to top right, but also top left to bottom right. And the problem is that means this width and height can be negative. And we don't care if they're negative, really. So we want to get the absolute value. And all the absolute value means is if it's minus 10, it'll give us 10. But if it's just 10, it'll also give us 10. It just basically removes the negative. It always gives you the magnitude of the variable. So if it's minus 120 and you do the absolute of it, you just get 120. So what we want to do here is make a new vector 2 where the width is so there's a built-in thing in Unity math f, and it has an abs function, mathf absolute. So you just pass in the value, which is the width, so area width, and that'll give you, regardless of if it's negative, it'll always give you the positive version. If it's positive, it'll just return the same thing. And then mathf dot abs area height, and that's that line. And then for the height, it's the unit selection area dot anchored position, and it's going to be equal to our current start position plus, and then it's going to be half of our width and half of our height. Because if we look back over in Unity and we go to the map 01, let's go to the scene view. You see over here we've got our UI. Let's select it. Imagine we started clicking in this bottom left point, and we've now dragged up to the top right point. We want our position to be directly in the middle. So we want to say go halfway along the width, go halfway up the height, and that gives you the center. So that's what we want here. We want to say add a new vector 2, which is half the width, so area width divided by 2, and half the height, area height divided by 2. That's slightly going over the end now, so let's just put this onto a new line or something, just to make it a bit easier to read. And now that we've coded this, we can go back into Unity, we can go to our drag box and change this anchor to be the bottom left. Because as we said, we want to have this corner point and then figure out half the width and half the height. We're not going to get too much into how the UI works here. Let's just reset all these values to 0. And let's make sure to reference it inside our script. Drag it into the unit selection handler. And now what we should be able to do is we can go back to the menu scene. We can hit run. And we will actually get an error here, but it won't affect us testing the drag select. So let's hit host. If I was to click and drag, you see I get my box here. And as I move my cursor around, I'm still holding down left click, the box updates. The only problem is right now, if I release, we don't clear it, so it just kind of stays. And if I drag around, drag around, drag around, it works like this. Now we want to add the code in to clear the area when we release our mouse button. Let's head back over into the script. So down in the clear selection area function, you see we do the single unit click to raycast. And it's not really what we want when we want to do multi-selecting. So let's just work down from the top. The first thing we want to do when clearing is just turn off the UI. It's done now. Unit selection area game object set active false. So we're going to deactivate the game object. And as I said, this logic here is just for single units. We still want to be able to raycast a single unit if we just click, if we don't bother dragging. So what we can do is we can say if the unit selection area dot size, so you can check the magnitude. So by doing dot magnitude, the size delta dot magnitude. If we say if that's equal to 0, it means that we clicked and we didn't start dragging. So in that case, we want to run all this code. So let's cut and paste that into here and return. So it means that's it, we're done, right? If it's 0, it means we just clicked, do what we did already. And now down here, we can add in the code for multi-selecting. Let's quickly look back at the diagram. Let's imagine this red dot is one of our tanks, and we've drag selected it. We're definitely inside the drag select. But how does our code know that? Well, we have the coordinates of these points on the corners. So what we can do is we can get the min vector 2, which is the coordinate of the bottom left yellow circle down there. And then we can get the max vector 2, which is the coordinates of this up here. So that might be, let's say, -1, -2, and this can be 1, 2. You can then get the coordinate of this tank or this red dot and say, if the x of this is greater than this x and less than this x, whilst also being less than this y and greater than the bottom y, it means it's inside this bounding box. Once we start writing the code for this, it should make even more sense. It's quite simple. So let's get the min and the max. So vector 2 min is, so it's the current unit selection area dot position, anchored position, minus half the size. Because remember, this is a vector 2, so we can't just like use the magnitude again, or we can't use the width and the height. We have to use the actual size delta, which is a vector 2. So the unit selection area dot size delta, but we need half of this. It's all about half because obviously if we just take the full width, then we're going to go too far past it. We have to go halfway from the center point. And then max is basically the same thing. So vector 2 max equals unit selection area dot anchored position plus, because it's a max, the unit selection area dot size delta over 2. So now we've got our min and max point. We're now going to loop over all of our units. So for each unit, we'll call it unit, in Now remember, we have our player, so we can say player.getMyUnits. Oh, we can't because we don't actually have that method yet. Let's jump over to the RTS player. So we have the units, but we don't currently have a way of getting it. So let's just make a getter up here. Public list of type unit, get my units. And all it's going to do is it's going to simply return my units. And then we can go back and we can say .get my units. Want to do a for each loop. And keep in mind, currently, all these values here, this min and max and all this stuff, this is all in screen space, whereas our tank is in world space. So what we can do is we can use our camera. So we already used the camera to do this raycasting. We can say, we want to get the screen position of our tank. Like, where would our tank be if it was on our screen? So we can say screen position equals main camera dot, and there's this thing called world to screen point, and we can pass in our unit.transform.position, and that'll give us its position on the screen. And then we need to do those X and Y checks like I mentioned on the slide. So if the screen position.x is greater than the min.x, it means we're within that bound, but we need to check all 4 bounds to make sure we're inside the box. So and screen position.x is less than max.x, so that's the x min and max. Then we need to do the y min and max. And screen position.y is greater than min.y. And finally, and screen position.y is greater than max. Less than max.y. And this is obviously too long again, so I'll just put it onto multiple lines. But let's keep it so the ands are at the end, like so. And we can indent these. So this is telling us if this unit is within the box, selected units, selected units.add, we'll add the unit, and then we'll also call the select method. Just like how we would do it up here, we say add it to the list and select it. We're now saying add it to the list and select it. So we've done with the logic, but like I mentioned earlier, there was that error that was happening when we tried to do the drag select in the UI. The error wasn't affecting us just then. But what it was that here, when we try and get the player, it's actually null. It fails to get us the player. And the reason is because when we press play, it immediately switches scene, and it actually tries to get the player before it even exists, which is not great. And we will be fixing this when we make the lobby, because when we've got a lobby, the player will exist in the lobby ages before this selection handler exists. So we won't even have to worry about that. But for now, we want some kind of temporary fix just so we can use it for now. We could, in the update, just get the component every single frame, but that's not great because every single frame doing this is very slow. Even though we probably wouldn't notice the difference, it's not very good, even as a temporary fix. What we can do, though, is we can get it every frame until we've got it, and then once we've got it, we can stop doing that. So we can do a check to say, like, if the player is null, then we can try to get it here. Then we can take the line where we get the player, and we can just do it in here. This will actually like throw one error, because what will happen is the first time it tries to get the player when it can't, it'll say an error saying the connection doesn't exist or the identity doesn't exist. But then when we next come around, it will exist, we'll grab it, and then this will stop even being called because player won't be null, and it'll continue as normal. I think it only actually happens for 1 frame anyway, and let's give it a test. So if we go back, we hit play, what should happen is it should give us maybe 1 error in the console when we hit play. Yep, you see here it said, oh, it was 2 actually, so there were 2 frames where this caused a problem. But now if we were to spawn in a tank, move it, let's spawn in a few tanks. Okay, so I can still click to just select them, and I can drag select to select both of them, or bring in a third one, and drag select all 3. I can just spawn in loads, spawn in a few more, and I can just drag select these 2, or these 3, or all 6 of them, and it all works. So yeah, that's it for this lecture. We now have multi-selecting. It's pretty fun. You can obviously add more to this, because if I have these 3 selected and I want to now have all 6, I'd have to do a big select. I can't go select and then hold a key down and select. That's a feature we could add, so you can hold down like shift, select these, and you get all 6. But yeah, it still works, which is pretty cool. And now we can move on to do some more interesting stuff like attacking. So we can make some enemy units, enemy buildings, and have it so if I select and then click, it will actually they'll all move over until they're in range, and then stop, and then start shooting. Be pretty fun. And obviously this error, like I mentioned, is just a temporary fix until we build the lobby system, and once we've got a lobby working, we won't need this and we can come back and remove it. It's just a little fix for now so we can get it all working a lot faster. So that's it for now, and I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye.